Geology and ecology are woven together in so many interesting ways, in the Ozarks and beyond. So when we were invited to give a talk to the Kansas City chapter of the Missouri Master Naturalist program, we knew we wanted to emphasize these connections. Here's a lightly edited Zoom recording of the original talk. Enjoy!
All right, so thank you for that intro. We are indeed the hosts of Ozark Outsider on YouTube. We love Kansas City, as you may notice in some later photos, and we're thrilled to be speaking to you tonight. Tonight, we're going to focus on 4 themes: why naturalists should care about geology, a brief overview of Ozark geology, some online resources to enhance your field experiences, and some Kansas City geologic highlights. But like a good Ozarker, we'll begin with a story. While exploring this glade on dolomite bedrock, I noticed a thin sandstone layer and began following it. On an exposed ledge, I found an isolated patch of fame flower, which wasn't previously known within this dolomite-dominated area. Why was it there? Well, fame flower prefers an acidic substrate, which dolomite doesn't provide, but sandstone does. Recognizing that sandstone outcrop, and that it was unusual, led me to an interesting plant. Knowing this, you can look for fame flower on other acidic substrates. And fame flower is far from the only plant influenced by bedrock type.
So quite a few fern species are actually often pretty partial to specific substrates. So can you tell these two ferns apart? So overall, I'm not a fern expert, but over time, I've learned that if I see something that looks approximately like this with twice divided leaves, I can usually count on the substrate to point me in the right direction for species identification. So if it's on sandstone or igneous rock, and this photo is on rhyolite, those are all acidic substrates, then I'm going to hypothesize that it's marginal wood fern. I flip over the leaves, and if the reproductive structures are at the edge or margin of the leaves, then I'm going to conclude that I was right, that, yep, that was marginal wood fern. On the other hand, if it's on carbonate substrate like limestone or dolomite, something that's more basic, I'm going to think of a different fern. I want to flip over those leaves and look for little bulblets, which would make it the bulblet fern. So I found that substrate is a pretty reliable predictor of what I'm going to find when it comes to fern ID, at least for these two. And so rock identification can sometimes help with plant identification. But can it go the other way? Can plant identification help with rock identification? So this is the Missouri orange coneflower, and it really likes dolomite glades, where it tends to grow in pretty big colonies. And it's pretty identifiable even in the winter because you'll see a bunch of its heads standing up above the ground as part of a bigger colony. So this is a fun little experience from just a week ago. Eric and I were looking at the contact between some really well-exposed igneous rock and some younger sedimentary rock, which we expected was around somewhere, but the contact was being a little hard to find. As it turned out, there was a colony of this Rudbeckia missouriensis, the Missouri orange coneflower. And here I've circled just a few of the heads. There are more, but I didn't want to spend all day putting circles on here. But this is the patch that has that plant growing on it. And it turns out it was growing on the patch of dolomite we were looking for, simultaneously providing a clue of what was below our feet. At the same time, it was sneakily obscuring it from view. And we didn't find some better exposed dolomite just next door, which convinced us of that's what was under these as well. But I'd say that, yes, plant ID can sometimes help with rock ID. So sometimes geologists themselves create plant habitat, as with these mosses that are colonizing holes that were drilled by geologists to collect samples for analysis from what happens to be a pretty famous road cut in the Missouri Ozarks. So many mosses and liverworts are in fact pretty particular about their substrates, but instead of drilling down to an even smaller scale, let's move up in size. So geology can affect plant distribution at the landscape scale as well. So in this photo, you can notice the clear division between areas dominated by leaf-off hardwoods on the upper slope and areas on the lower slope where there are a lot of evergreen eastern red cedars, mixed in with some hardwoods as well. Here's an aerial photo view of the same area, showing the same pattern. We can digitally remove the vegetation by looking at the LiDAR. Sometimes geologists want to actually remove the vegetation so we can see the rock. But here we can see that there's a clear topographic relationship between the trees and the bed and the topography, but that dividing line is actually based in geology. So it's the geology is driving the difference in tree growth on these different geologic formations. And here's the aerial photo again to show that. So here at Hahatonka State Park, there's another interesting example of geology influencing ecology. So here there are two glades on a slope, a higher one and a lower one. In between, there's a fault running across the landscape. So it turns out that each of these glades are hosted on the same bedrock formation, and the fault displaced the bedrock vertically, so that same glade hosting stratigraphic layer ended up being repeated higher and lower on the slope. So it's the same stratigraphy with the glade in different locations. So the full story is actually more complicated, and we encourage you to check out our channel's playlist of videos exploring the geology of Hahatonka and its effects on park ecology. So geology is pretty key to distinguishing and classifying many plant communities in Missouri, and glades were a focus of a recent Department of Natural Resources report on the topic. And MDC also recognizes 5 types of glades that are classified not specifically by their plant communities, but by their bedrock type. So limestone, dolomite, chert, sandstone, and igneous glades. But it's not just glades that rely on bedrock. Geology is an integral part to the classification system for the terrestrial natural communities of the state. And a geological classification system has been an important component in the designation of lands for the Missouri Natural Areas system. And these designated natural areas include some truly exceptional places and ecosystems in our state. So geology helps to determine slope, aspect, soils, hydrological components of the landscape. These are all really foundational to ecosystems themselves. So we could spend a lot of time talking about hydrology, but we'll settle for just a brief mention of karst hydrology. That is the sinkholes, caves, and springs that are so prevalent in the Ozarks. For example, caves host blind cavefish that have evolved for life underground in these karst systems. Missouri actually has 2 different species, and they live in different stratigraphic units within the Ozark Plateaus region. Fascinating aquatic plant communities are also supported by the cool water outflows of spring branches, as shown on the right, where a spring branch meets the current river. And we don't have time to go deeper into these subjects tonight, but we think there's just no way to really fully appreciate ecology without considering hydrology and therefore geology. It is, however, easy to think that geology always comes first and provides the context for biology. But geology and biology can be surprisingly interrelated. So it turns out that a substantial amount of Missouri's bedrock is carbonate rock, which formed from the remains of marine organisms. And so that rock wouldn't be there or wouldn't be as it is if those past ecosystems weren't the way they were. So even today, biology is still influencing geology. In these photos at Graham Cave State Park, mosses are actually playing a role in calcium carbonate deposition in the form of tufa. So these mosses are basically facilitating the real-time formation of brand new rock, albeit at a pretty small scale. And let's not forget that beavers are really important ecosystem engineers. They were largely eradicated from the region during European settlement, but they likely helped shape the regional landscape long beforehand. And they seem to be making a comeback in some places, including here at Johnson-Shudden State Park, where we saw a lot of beaver activity in the Lower Scour just last week. So hopefully we've convinced you that geology really matters. So with that, let's take a whirlwind tour of Ozark regional geology.
So this is a simplified geologic map of southern Missouri and northern Arkansas, which Joanna produced by merging data sets from the 2 states. As with most such maps, different colors represent different rock units found at the surface and their ages. But for clarity, let's simplify this even further. Here we're focusing just on Missouri and grouping surface bedrock into major regional categories. The Ozarks are dominated by a thick sequence of marine carbonate rocks, with a core of dolomite surrounded by a perimeter of limestone that also stretches up along the Mississippi. These are the rocks that host most of our abundant cave and spring systems. Then there are thinner beds of sandstone and shale in these areas that mostly can't be mapped at this scale, but can be locally very important. There's a small area of volcanic and other igneous rocks in the St. Francis Mountains of southeast Missouri, which host some of our most dramatic and unique scenery. Most of western and northern Missouri consists of a complex mix of sedimentary rocks, which we'll return to when we close this talk by discussing Kansas City geology. And there are quite recent deposits of sand and gravel along our river's floodplains. But what's the geologic history behind all this? So we're going to summarize about 1.5 billion years of geologic history in the next few minutes, so you'll have to forgive us for leaving out a few details. But most of Missouri's geologic record fits into 3 distinct periods of time. In the Precambrian era, extensive volcanic activity produced a variety of igneous rocks that are now exposed in southeast Missouri at places like Elephant Rocks and Johnson Shut-in State Park. Then there's a long period with no rock record, when all we really know is that a lot of erosion happened. About 500 million years ago, around the beginning of the Paleozoic era, shallow seas repeatedly spread across the region over the course of the next couple hundred million years or so. And the whole area ended up blanketed in a thick sequence of mostly marine dolomite and limestone that accounts for the vast majority of the bedrock we see today. Sadly for dinosaur buffs, there's another major time gap spanning their age and beyond, with a lot more erosion happening and very little evidence preserved. And we really don't have clear geologic records again until just a few million years ago, when major glaciation began affecting the region. Glacial ice reached North Missouri on more than one occasion, and though glaciers never penetrated into the Ozarks, major climate changes brought boreal forests to the region, and there's a clear record of Pleistocene megafauna such as giant sloths and giant beavers and mastodons and dire wolves. We have great fun trying to envision these creatures roaming the Ozark landscape. So, how have geologists developed the maps and timelines that describe our geologic history? One way is to study exposures at or near the surface, whether natural or man-made. A basic principle of geology states that younger sedimentary rocks overlie older ones, with a few exceptions that we're not going to go into here. But we don't always have a convenient quarry to look at, and those darn plants keep getting in the way. So how else can we explore the geologic sequence beneath us? Here we turn to well logs, which are careful records of the rocks encountered when a well is drilled for resource exploration or extraction. Here's one from northwest Missouri. As we scan down this log, keep in mind that we're starting with the youngest deposits at the surface and descending into ever older rocks with depth. We start with about 80 feet of glacial sediment before we even hit the youngest bedrock. Then we pass through thousands of feet of Paleozoic sedimentary rock, representing those hundreds of millions of years of mostly shallow marine conditions. And we finally stop 3,700 feet down when the drill hits that ancient Precambrian igneous rock. So if there's ancient Precambrian rock buried under 3,700 feet of sediment in northwest Missouri, but exposed at the surface in southeast Missouri, what's going on in between? There's a continuous Precambrian surface beneath the entire state. This is a 3D model Joanna developed from well log data, showing the Precambrian surface within Missouri, surrounded by the actual land surface beyond Missouri. It's quite complex, but you can clearly see how the highest surface appears in the heart of the Ozarks, while it descends far underground as you move to the north and west. To look at this another way, we'll draw on this more complicated official geologic map of Missouri, which includes a cross-section from northwest to southeast. Just a reminder, geologic maps show only the rocks that appear at the surface. So while there are Precambrian rocks beneath the entire state, they only appear on the map in a small area where they reach the surface. And they're overlain by that thick sequence of Paleozoic sedimentary rocks we discussed earlier. The overall pattern here is that of a dome, with the oldest rocks uplifted in the center of the St. Francis Mountains, and the rocks getting younger both as you move horizontally away from the dome and as you move up through the sequence. Going back to the map view, you can now recognize the signature bullseye pattern of the Missouri Ozarks and beyond, with those ancient Precambrian rocks at the center and the younger sedimentary rocks radiating out in all directions. You'll sometimes hear this referred to as the Ozark Dome or the Ozark Uplift. So as geologists and naturalists, we like to keep in mind that as our geologic history slowly evolved toward the Missouri landscape we know today, the ecology of what we now call Missouri has also been changing for many millions of years. From the warm shallow marine conditions that deposited these fossils, to frigid ice age conditions that hosted mastodons and dire wolves, and back to something in between. From a geologist's perspective, we're still just emerging from an ice age. And this affects how we think about concepts like ecological baselines, and even what it means for a species to be native. For example, how many native North American species do you see here? All of these plants are considered introduced into North America. But check the North American fossil record, and you'll see that each genus used to grow on this continent. For example, here's a fossilized leaf of the golden rain tree from Florissant fossil beds in Colorado, from the Eocene about 35 million years ago. And to go beyond plants, the standard narrative is that horses were introduced to North America by the Spanish. But the first horses actually evolved here over 50 million years ago and spread elsewhere before going extinct in North America. So from a geologist's perspective, ecosystems aren't necessarily defined by historical baselines like the year of 1491, but are constantly evolving, such that ginkgos and horses really could be considered native species if you expand your time horizons. And if you're someone who advocates for restoring native animals extirpated by humans, be careful consulting a geologist. Because those of us who have gardens and orchards, we know how hard it is to manage deer, and we really don't want to manage mastodons. So has all that time travel tired you out? Let's talk about some ways to learn about geologic resources from the comfort of home. And we'll provide links to all these resources by email to Zoom participants today and in the text below when this goes up on YouTube. So an essential digital tool that you've already seen us use in this talk is GeoStrat. This is an online mapping application provided by the Missouri Department of Natural Resources that contains all sorts of useful data sets, like geologic mapping at various scales, natural features like springs and sinkholes, and man-made features like well log and mine locations. A similar tool is the USGS's National Map. This serves up a variety of mapping resources at a national scale, including seamlessly digitized topo maps and LiDAR data, landscape maps measured by laser. Yet another geologic resource is the National Geologic Map Database, which serves up digitized geologic maps at various scales. Keep in mind that GeoStrat only covers Missouri, so if you're interested in border regions like Kansas, this is a great resource. Yet another useful resource is the official stratigraphic column for Missouri, compiled by the Missouri Geologic Survey. This summarizes the vertical sequence of rocks found in Missouri in a fair amount of detail, from oldest at the lower right to youngest at the upper left. This is available as a digital file and can be really helpful. And there are certainly a variety of useful books. And of course, you can start catching up on our YouTube channel's ongoing Geology of the Ozarks series and other relevant content. Here's one example of how you might put these tools to use. Can you tell which of these is igneous and which is sedimentary? I hope we've convinced you that it's important to be able to identify rock type, but this is something that's best learned in the field, and it's really hard to teach by Zoom. These two examples are clearer than most you'll actually encounter in the field. But if you can read and interpret a geologic map, you can try and figure out what you might expect in a given location, and then compare that to what you see in the field. But we also want to issue a warning. As with any resource, beware of factual or data errors. This is the Marble Creek Campground in the heart of the Missouri Ozarks, which sits in a loop of Marble Creek and features a scenic mill dam. If you were to consult this geologic map on Geostrat, you would assume that the entire campground and dam site are underlain by sedimentary rocks, with a pocket of igneous rock farther up the hill to the south. But we were recently there, and we can assure you that both the mill site and the opposite side of the creek loop are in fact underlain by igneous rocks that probably all connect as one body. You can even see this in LiDAR data, which clearly show a rugged, knobbly texture along the creek at both places where we personally observed unmapped igneous rock. And this texture is typical of igneous shut-ins in the Ozarks. In this case, there seems to be a mapping error. This clearly wrong map is at one scale, but this one is at another. And this second one is at least closer to what we actually saw on the ground. So use maps, but beware of their limitations. And unfortunately, public interpretive materials are also prone to errors. Here are a few signs we'll point out from two different agencies just in the St. Francis Mountains, deliberately obscuring their source because the goal isn't to call out or embarrass anyone. All of these make the mistake of not knowing the difference between intrusive igneous rocks like granite that cool slowly as magma far beneath the surface, and volcanic igneous rocks like rhyolite that erupt onto the surface as beds of lava or ash and cool quickly. The first sign implies that volcanic rhyolite cools slowly underground, which it very much doesn't. While the second sign correctly identifies the local volcanic rock at this site, but then goes on to describe it as granite, which it very much isn't. And this unfortunate map states that all the igneous rock in Missouri is volcanic, which it most certainly is not. 2 of the 4 locations marked here are actually granite. So all the more reason to build up your geologic knowledge before heading outdoors.
Right, so now we're going to shift gears and focus our discussion on some local Kansas City area geologic highlights. So this is at the Firemen's Memorial on 87th Street near the Blue River. It's a memorial that's worth a visit, but for the moment, we're going to talk about it because it's part of an old quarry. And it's a good place to pull off from the road and get an overview of some of the local bedrock geology. So as you can see, the bedding of these sedimentary rocks is essentially horizontal. It's flat-lying. There is still a gentle regional dip away from the Ozark Dome, but that's not the kind of thing you're going to see at an outcrop scale like this. So the bulk of the rock you can see in this photo, the gray stuff to beige to tan stuff that's holding up these resistant rock faces, that's all limestone. There are also multiple intervals of shale between some of the limestone layers, especially in those steps back in the quarry. And but most of the shale isn't all that thick. It doesn't stand up well to weathering, so it's not particularly prominent in the photo. If you do visit the site, which we recommend, you should take a look at the full stratigraphic column that's available through one of the resources and the links that we'll share with you. But for today, we want to just highlight one rock unit in particular that you can see here. This is one that's notable for historic, economic, scenic, and ecological reasons, and it's the Bethany Falls limestone, which crops out in a variety of places in the region. So one outcrop of this rock crops out along the Missouri River in a place that made a good steamboat landing early in the history of the Kansas City area. The Bethany Falls limestone has also been quarried for use as building stone and for other uses. And in some of those places where it's been quarried from underground, that's opened up storage space. It's opened up these basically man-made caverns that's used for storage, for manufacturing, and for other purposes. And it is also of particular importance to naturalists because it crops out at a variety of parks, including Blue River Glades Natural Area, which is just a short distance from the Firemen's Memorial, as well as Burr Oak Conservation Area and River Bluff Nature Reserve, among others. And in some of these places, glades form on top of the Bethany Falls limestone. So the Bethany Falls is about 20 feet thick. It's relatively uniform. It does vary somewhat in thickness. And it tends to weather to more of a gray color compared to some of the other limestones that, as you can see in this photo, tend to weather to more of a brown or tan color. So it's reasonably identifiable. So another question about these rocks is, how old are they? Well, if we were to consult a geologic map and look at the key, we can find that they're from the late Paleozoic, specifically from the Pennsylvanian period. And if we take a broader look at Pennsylvanian stratigraphy, this is from that composite Missouri stratigraphic column that Eric showed earlier. And this summarizes a sequence of rock that can be traced across a fairly wide geographic area. So the column on the left would stack on top of the column on the right if the screen were taller. So the oldest is at the bottom right, youngest is at the top left. So the section that we were looking at in that previous photo, the Bethany Falls is part of the slope formation, and then these red brackets show the part of the stratigraphy that was shown in that previous slide at the Fireman's Memorial. So the reason that we're taking a look at this is to get an overview of the lithologies of Missouri's Pennsylvanian rock. And here are some of the symbols that represent common lithologies in the sequence. From bottom to top, we've got limestone, shale, sandstone, and coal. And if you take some time to study this, you'll notice a lot of repetition of some or all of that sequence, sometimes with some clay thrown in or some variation, but there's quite a bit of repetition. And for example, the coal, those black lines stand out really well in the column. You might note that there's not one big thick bed of coal, but rather multiple black lines representing numerous smaller beds of coal. So what would cause all of these changes in lithology? Well, one way to get that is for sea level to rise and fall repeatedly. And so geologists have actually pieced together a story from looking at rocks in other parts of the world that involves a continental configuration in the late Pennsylvanian, or in the Pennsylvanian, that was conducive for a whole series of glaciations. So there was actually a significant amount of continental landmass down at the South Pole at that time. Missouri, however, was hanging out not down at the South Pole, but more in the equatorial regions. So instead of being directly impacted by glacial ice at the time, it was indirectly subjected to repeated changes in water levels, which changed sedimentary deposition and ecosystems along the way. So at times, there were coastal coal swamps with plants in a given place, and at times the water got deeper, for example, and there were marine organisms that are responsible for carbonate bedrock, like the Bethany Falls limestone. So if you remember this map from earlier in the talk, there was that mixed sedimentary designation. Well, those are the places that are mapped as having Pennsylvanian bedrock. And it's not easy just to pick one lithology that represents all of those places. All right, let's switch perspective now. This time we're going to look at a vertical cross-section that spans the Missouri River Valley near Kansas City. And so far we've talked about the Paleozoic sedimentary bedrock. So here I'll highlight that Pennsylvanian bedrock in green, but that's not the end of the story. There's also younger material on the landscape, both in the river bottoms and on top of the hills. And these other materials aren't consolidated into bedrock, but they still tell an important part of the story. So what are these deposits? Well, there's glacial till, and that was deposited directly by glaciers. This cross-section shows some below the Missouri River, as well as some on the north side of the river, on the bluffs, and even on the south side of the river. That's curious, and we'll come back to that. There's also windblown loess. Those are windblown sediments, something I'll discuss more in a moment as well. And then there's alluvium, or sediment carried by and deposited by rivers. So on this cross-section, it shows up in the Missouri River Valley, and it also occurs on tributary valleys as well. So some of that alluvium is very recent, but some of these unconsolidated deposits go back as far as the Pleistocene. The Pleistocene is a time period from about 2.5 million years ago to about 12,000 years ago, when repeated rounds of glaciation affected the northern part of our continent. And we'll talk about that more in a second, but before I move on from this cross-section, one thing that I want to point out in particular is just how deep the bedrock channel is. There's 185 feet of unconsolidated till and alluvium on top of the bedrock channel. So there's this essentially a buried bedrock canyon under this Missouri River sediment, which I think is really cool. And remember that number, the 185 feet, because we're going to have another number to compare to that in a few minutes. But first, we need to look at a little bit of backstory on the glacial history as a setup for a fun final story. So during the most recent glaciation, which is the Wisconsin, glacial ice did not reach Missouri. During the last glacial maximum, it got as far as Des Moines, as you can see in the darker blue on this map. Glaciers, however, did affect the upper part of the Missouri River basin. And so a lot of meltwater came down the Missouri River, carrying a lot of sediment, and some of the silt got picked up, blown by the wind, and deposited nearby in the landscape. So this photo is from Weston Bend State Park, a bit north of Kansas City. It's a good place to go and see some loess-covered hills. And for the botany buff, there are a variety of public lands farther north along the Missouri River in northwest Missouri, where there's some really cool prairie remnants that are specific to these loess hills. So a lot of the loess we see today was related to melting from this most recent round of glaciation. Some of it is older, and there was an older glaciation before that. The next oldest one was the Illinoisan. It doesn't even show up in the geographic region covered by this map. You can probably guess that a major ice lobe from this one reached down into much of Illinois, maybe a bit crossed over into St. Louis, but the important parts of Missouri weren't affected directly by glacial ice at that time. If we go farther back in time, there were multiple ice advances before the Illinoisan, which geologists call the pre-Illinoisan, and they're in pale blue on this. So at this point, we're talking about a timescale of hundreds of thousands of years to over 2 million years ago. And these glaciations get lumped together as the pre-Illinoisan because teasing apart the details of specific advances isn't always particularly easy. But at least one of these pre-Illinoisan ice advances really left its mark on the Kansas City area, with glacial ice proper coming down into this region. So the glaciers left some physical deposits, so till directly, as well as loess indirectly, but they also left some other fingerprints on the landscape. So this shaded relief map spans the area across the Kansas-Missouri border, with downtown Kansas City about right here. And if you look at this map, do you notice anything odd in the drainage pattern? So let's break this down. Here is the Missouri River flowing west to east across this wide valley in its modern channel. From the southwest, we can see the Kansas or the Kaw River flowing in to join the Missouri. From the south, the Blue River is another Missouri River tributary. But what's up with this curious gap in this ridge and with this low spot that connects the Kaw and the Blue Rivers? Let's take a look at a geologic map of that curious channel area, and let's expand that. Let's zoom in. So under the uplands, there's Pennsylvania bedrock, and in places it's capped with loess. That's a kind of weird orange tan color. There are also a couple places mapped, I've circled them, that as having glacial till. So that implies that glacial ice directly deposited that material. So we're still curious about this valley that goes here. And there's a well log at the location shown by that blue dot. Let's take a look at that well log. It shows about 240 feet of what it calls glacial drift. So unconsolidated material that's somehow associated with glaciation. And there are other cores down in this channel that show something similar to a depth of even 260 feet. So remember how we were impressed by a 185-foot channel down to bedrock in the main Missouri River channel? Now this is even deeper. How can we explain this? So we're going to go back to this shaded relief map, but let's remember that the modern map isn't going to provide a full, accurate representation of what the landscape looked like in the pre-glacial era, 2 or 3 million years ago. But we're going to assume that a number of essential characteristics would have been similar. I am going to conjecture that there was a continuous ridge where this gap is now. And also, based on the distribution of till deposits, we can say that a glacial ice lobe came across the existing Missouri River Valley as far as downtown Kansas City. This is a very crude representation of the ice lobe. I'm not even going to pretend that I know the exact geometry. The upstream configuration of the rivers was probably different at the time. Regardless of the details, we can say at the time, at least the Kaw River would have been delivering water from the west. And so it would have been blocked by this glacial ice. So that would cause water to pool upstream. But water's pretty determined to go downhill. So if ice blocks its path, it's going to look for another way around. This seems to have been the weak point. So perhaps at some point, water started overflowing a ridge here, poured through this valley at the edge of the ice, carving a deep channel into the bedrock before rejoining the main valley. And there's another bit of evidence for this. Within that blue circle at the nose of one of those ridges, there's a boulder deposit with boulders up to 4 feet in diameter, mostly of local bedrock, at this narrow constriction point, a place that probably carried some pretty turbulent water through it. So eventually, glacial ice melted, this channel got abandoned, flow returned to the main valley, the valley of what is now the Missouri River. And this abandoned valley is what we now call Turkey Creek. But that's not quite the end of the story, because people noticed that this valley makes an excellent route for transportation because it allows for a way through Kansas City across gentle topography without being subjected to Missouri River floods. So it's become a really important rail corridor. It hosts Union Station, and it carries a large amount of rail traffic to this day. But you may be wondering, what does this story have to do with being a naturalist? Well, we think it's really worth thinking about why some places remain relatively pristine, while others have turned into cities. And we think it's interesting to think about the fact that there was an outcrop of bedrock that worked really well as a steamboat landing that contributed to growth in this area, and that there was also an abandoned glacial ice margin outflow channel that turned out to be a great rail corridor. And to consider that these geologic factors at some level probably contributed to the development of Kansas City as it is now. And yet, in spite of all this development, within the Kansas City area, there are a lot of really interesting natural areas as well, such as the glades on top of the Bethany Falls limestone. So were these places, some of these with these blocky chunks of limestone, just inconvenient enough to build upon that it let a number of these interesting places persist as undeveloped parkland? These are some of the big picture things that we think are really fun to think about, and we like to mull over how geology and history have shaped today's ecosystems.
So let's close by returning to the question we started with. How has this place changed over time? From a geologist's perspective, we can employ imagination and envision a time without bush honeysuckle, although granted, that's hard to imagine. And then a time with boreal forests and megafauna. A time with dust storms that piled lush deposits high on the river bluffs. A time with glacial ice that covered the landscape and backed up lakes that drained in channel-carving ice margin floods. A time when North America had horses and golden rain trees, and earlier even dinosaurs, even though most direct records of these are missing in Missouri. A time with warm seas teeming with marine life. And if you go back far enough, a time when molten rock began laying the foundation for modern Missouri, well over 1 billion years later. So our takeaway message is that recognizing these vast changes over time in a particular place provides a slightly different perspective to the geologically informed mind and can help better appreciate the modern ecology we so love to explore.
Thanks again to our host for the chance to give this talk and for agreeing to let us place the recording here on YouTube where anyone can access it. Feel free to leave questions in the comments below and check out lots of links to resources in the video text.